It was an offer born of contempt, an impossible challenge designed to be the ultimate humiliation of a young Apache. But what began as a cruel joke would become the legend that would cost the most powerful man in the region an entire empire. If stories about the power of dignity resonate with you, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey together. The air in the corral vibrated with a palpable tension, thick with the suffocating dust kicked up by Shadow's furious hooves. The black horse, a mountain of muscle and wild fury, was less an animal and more an indomitable spirit of the desert itself. His eyes, glowing embers in the darkness of his coat, were fixed on the thin, motionless young man in the center of the arena. Around them, perched on the wooden fences, Don Ricardo Montenegro's cowboys laughed, a chorus of mockery that cut through the hot afternoon air. To them, the Apache boy, Nahuel, was nothing more than a spectacle, a distraction before the inevitable end. They bet on how long it would take for him to be broken, trampled by the beast that had already sent stronger, more experienced men to the infirmary. Don Ricardo watched from his balcony, a smirk of superiority on his face, savoring the humiliation he himself had orchestrated. Nahuel remained still, feeling the ground tremble beneath his feet with each charge from the animal. He ignored the sharp laughter, the contempt that emanated from every gaze. His own eyes, nicknamed Ojo de Viento for their silent intensity, saw not only Shadow's fury, but the fear that fueled it. He saw a trapped spirit as displaced and defiant as his own. As the great horse reared, neighing a war cry that echoed through the valley, Nahuel did not flinch. Instead, he took a single, slow step forward, an almost imperceptible movement amidst the chaos. It was a gesture that silenced part of the crowd, an act of insanity or of a courage they could not comprehend. The world seemed to hold its breath, time stretching, as the force of nature and the resilience of a forgotten people faced each other, a breath away from collision. The quiet that settled was more deafening than the previous chaos. Shadow, the great stallion, stopped his charge, the dust settling slowly around his hooves. He snorted, steam rising from his nostrils like smoke, but his furious eyes now held a spark of confusion. Nahuel offered no rope or whip, but the sound of his voice. Low and soft, he began to speak, not in Spanish, but in the melodic language of his people, words that the wind carried like ancient seeds. It was less an order and more a song, a lament for the stolen land and the free spirits. He began to move, not forward, but in a slow, deliberate arc, keeping his body relaxed, his shoulders low, his hands open and visible. He was not a tamer. He was an equal, offering a dialogue instead of a duel. The spell was broken by the harsh sound of laughter from the fence. "He's singing to the horse," one of the cowboys shouted, and the chorus of mockery began again, though with less conviction than before. "Savage witchcraft," another spat on the ground. On the balcony, Don Ricardo's smile had vanished, replaced by a thin, hard line on his lips. This was not what he had planned. He had expected violence, fear, the swift and brutal affirmation of his power through the boy's destruction. Instead, he witnessed something he did not understand, a silent communion that excluded him. Shadow, for his part, seemed to ignore the growing noise. The horse took a hesitant step, not back in retreat, but to the side, mirroring Nahuel's arc, his head now low, ears pricked forward, listening to the song that only he and the young Apache seemed to understand. Nahuel's hand rose, not with the speed of a strike, but with the slowness of a falling leaf. The song on his lips ceased, replaced by a silence that was an extension of the land itself. His fingers touched the horse's sweaty mane, then the warm, trembling skin of its neck. Shadow shuddered, a tremor running through his powerful muscles, but he did not pull back. Instead, the great animal let out a long, deep sigh, the warm air from his lungs blowing against Nahuel's chest. The fire in the horse's eyes turned to calm embers, reflecting the figure of the young man who had not challenged him, but acknowledged him. A dead silence fell over the corral. The sound of a falling coin would have sounded like thunder. With his hand still on the horse's neck, Nahuel took the final step, standing side by side with the creature everyone called a demon. He then leaned in, resting his forehead against the stallion's powerful face, closing his eyes. It was an act of total surrender, a gesture of trust that transcended the barrier between species. There was no longer a tamer and a beast, only two spirits recognizing the same wound, the same longing for freedom. From his balcony, Don Ricardo felt a chill run down his spine. The humiliation he had planned, for the boy was now turning against him, reflected in the astonished faces of his men. He did not see a savage taming a horse. He saw an ancient and incomprehensible force, a power not measured in land or gold, and for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the region tasted the bitter taste of fear. Slowly, Nahuel straightened, breaking the physical contact, but not the connection he had forged. With a gentle hand on Shadow's thick mane, he swung himself up in a single fluid motion, landing softly on the animal's back. There was no saddle, no reins, nothing to suggest control. Shadow stood motionless, an ebony pedestal for the figure who now sat erect on his back. A murmur ran through the crowd of cowboys, a sound of pure amazement that replaced the mockery. Nahuel was no longer the butt of the joke. He was a king on a throne no one knew existed, his silent posture an indictment against all who had doubted him. With a light touch on the horse's neck, Nahuel guided him away from the center of the corral. Shadow moved with a calm that had seemed impossible moments before, his steps deliberate and unhurried. The cowboys backed away, clearing a path as if for an apparition. The ride ended directly in front of the balcony, where Don Ricardo Montenegro stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Nahuel lifted his chin, and his eyes met the rancher's. For the first time, they met not as inferior and superior, but as equals. Then, breaking the heavy silence, Nahuel's voice rang out clear and firm, carrying the exact words that had started it all. Tame the beast, and the ranch is yours. This turning point, where honor silences arrogance, is the heart of our story. Leave your support for Nahuel in the comments and subscribe to find out how this clash of giants ends. The silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to have form and weight. Don Ricardo's face went from the pale white of surprise to a deep, angry red, a vein throbbing in his temple. For a moment he was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. When his voice finally tore through the air, it was a low, venomous snarl. It was a joke, you insolent fool, a joke for us to enjoy your agony. He spat the words out, desperately trying to reassert his dominance, but the conviction in his voice was fragile. His own men were not looking at him, but at the imposing figure of Nahuel and the horse, a sight that defied everything they knew. The joke had died, and everyone knew who the fool was now. Nahuel did not reply with words. He didn't have to. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile, a gesture that held more contempt than any insult Don Ricardo could utter. Then, with the same calm with which he had approached the beast, he turned Shadow. The great horse moved like a liquid shadow, obeying a command that was neither seen nor heard. Together, they headed for the open gate of the corral, not with the haste of an escape, but with the dignity of one leaving a conquered territory. The sound of Shadow's hooves on the dry earth was the only sound, a steady, deliberate rhythm that marked the end of an era and the beginning of a legend. They did not look back, riding toward the open plains, leaving behind a powerful man choking on his own impotence and the echo of a promise he never should have made. The sound of the hooves became a distant echo, and then silence. A silence that weighed on the shoulders of every man in the corral. It was Don Ricardo who broke it, not with a shout, but with a guttural sound of pure fury. He turned to his cowboys, his eyes bloodshot. "What are you looking at? That horse is mine. I want that savage's head on a platter and my horse back in its stall before nightfall." The order was clear, but no one moved. The fear of Montenegro's fury warred with a newfound dread of Nahuel's silent power. It took a second roar, and the threat of a whip for the men to scramble awkwardly toward their horses. Their confidence shattered, and their enthusiasm replaced by a deadly reluctance. Far away, the rhythm of Shadow's ride was steady and powerful. The horse was not running scared, but galloping with purpose, as if he were finally going home. Nahuel felt no triumph, only a deep calm, the same calm as the wind that swept the plain. He knew that what happened in the corral was not an end, but a beginning. It was not about possessing Montenegro's land, but about proving that a man's dignity cannot be bought or humiliated. He had accepted the challenge and answered in the only language the land and the spirits understood. By taking Shadow, he was not stealing an animal. He was reclaiming a piece of that land's soul, a piece that Montenegro could never truly own. The chase began under the weight of a bad omen. Led by Mateo, Don Ricardo's foreman, the cowboys rode into the twilight. But the bravado they displayed in front of their boss had dissipated, replaced by a tense silence. Shadow's tracks were blatantly clear in the dust, easy to follow. Too easy. It was not the trail of a fugitive, but that of a guide. "He's not running from us," a young rider murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "He's leading us somewhere." Mateo did not reply, but the same thought chilled his bones. They were not hunting a horse thief. They were following a specter into the heart of a territory that did not belong to them. Nahuel felt the pursuit, not with his ears, but with his skin, like a change in the air pressure. It was a feverish, clumsy noise far behind them, a disturbance in the harmony of the land that was preparing for sleep. Beneath him, Shadow moved with a stamina that seemed to be born from the very ground. The horse showed no fatigue, only a restrained joy at finally running free, guided by a hand that sought not to dominate, but to understand. As the first star appeared in the deepening indigo sky, Nahuel altered their course slightly, leading the stallion toward the rocky canyons that rose on the horizon like stone teeth. This was his world, a labyrinth of shadows and echoes where a man's power was measured not by his possessions, but by his attunement with the land. The entrance to the canyons swallowed the twilight. The rock walls rose abruptly, turning the open sky into a narrow ribbon of indigo speckled with stars. The sound of the cowboys' horses' hooves changed, the muffled gallop of the plain becoming a sharp, treacherous echo that ricocheted off the stones, making it seem as if they were surrounded. The horses, used to open spaces, grew nervous, snorting and resisting the advance. Shadow's tracks, once so clear, were now lost on a bed of stones, and the growing darkness turned every shadow into a potential enemy. Mateo halted the group, cold sweat running down his back despite the night air. The silence between the echoes was deep, watchful. It felt as if the canyon itself was watching them. Miles away, in the heart of that stone labyrinth, Nahuel stopped. He slid from Shadow's back and placed a hand on the animal's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of his powerful heart. The horse lowered its head and drank from a spring that flowed from a crack in the rock, a secret known only to the ancients. Nahuel did not look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the dissonance of his pursuers on the wind, a clumsy anxiety that did not belong in that place. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of dust and night sage. He had not brought Montenegro's men into an ambush. He had brought them to a lesson on what it truly meant to own a land. It was not about fences and titles, but about knowing it, listening to it, and being a part of it. And in that world, they were the true intruders. Mateo finally signaled for them to stop, the sound of his own heart hammering in his ears. The darkness was almost total, and the stars, once guides, now seemed cold and distant through the crack of rock above. "Light a torch," he ordered, his voice sounding hoarse and small. The flickering flame that one of the men managed to light did more harm than good, casting dancing, monstrous shadows that distorted the canyon walls into grotesque faces. Nervousness turned into a fight. "We're hunting a ghost," one cowboy said, his eyes wide. "We should go back." "And say what to Don Ricardo?" retorted Mateo, though the same desire to flee consumed him. "Keep going. He can't have gone far." But his words sounded empty, a pathetic bravado, against the silent immensity that surrounded them. From above, on a ledge that seemed made for a hawk, Nahuel watched the small, trembling point of light crawling along the canyon floor. He felt no anger, no fear, just a kind of sad pity. They were like lost children, making noise in the dark to ward off what they did not understand. Beside him, Shadow stood perfectly still, a statue of living obsidian, sensing his companion's calm. Nahuel picked up a small stone from the ground, no bigger than his thumbnail. He did not throw it, he simply let it fall into the abyss. The small click of the stone hitting another, many feet below, echoed through the canyon like a rifle shot. The torch flickered and almost went out as the men flinched, and a terrified silence followed, broken only by the sound of the wind howling through the crevices, sounding like the wail of a spirit. The lesson had begun. The silence that followed the echo was dense and fragile. Mateo tried to regain control, his voice sounding forced. It was just a loose rock. Keep moving. But his words were lost in the darkness. "Rocks don't fall up, Mateo," said an older cowboy, his voice trembling. "The sound came from above. He's up there, watching us like vultures." The image froze the blood in the men's veins. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey, lured into a stone slaughterhouse, and fear had a metallic taste of imminent defeat. Every shadow seemed to writhe, and the wind, once just a sound, now seemed to whisper their names. Then a new sound joined the wail of the wind, a low, melancholic whistle which seemed to rise from the very rocks to their right. Before the echo dissipated, another identical whistle answered from the left side, louder and closer. Then a third, coming from somewhere ahead in the impenetrable darkness. It was not the call of a nocturnal animal. It was a language, a sound net closing in around them. Panic finally erupted. A horse reared, throwing its rider with a dull thud. The man holding the torch turned sharply, and the flame hit the stone wall, extinguishing with a final hiss. The darkness swallowed them completely, and the whistles continued, now seeming to come from all sides, laughing at their blindness. The chaos that ensued was absolute. The darkness, once a simple absence of light, became a living, hostile force. Men shouted orders that were lost in confused echoes. Horses bumped into each other in blind panic, and the sound of metal against stone and of falling bodies punctuated the confusion. Mateo yelled for them to calm down, to form a line, but his authority had disintegrated along with the torchlight. The chase was over. In its place was a disorderly stampede, a desperate race towards the canyon exit. They were no longer fleeing from an enemy. They were fleeing from their own runaway imaginations, haunted by ghostly whistles and the overwhelming certainty that they were powerless. From high above, Nahuel did not move. He listened to the sound of defeat receding down the canyon. The irregular gallop, the frightened cries, the distant weeping of a man who might have been left behind. Beside him, Shadow remained serene, the warmth of his body a point of calm in the cold night. Nahuel felt no pleasure in the humiliation of those men, only the solemn confirmation of an ancient truth. He had not needed to use an arrow or a spear. He had simply invited them into his world, a world governed by different rules, and let them break against their own ignorance. When the last echo of their escape dissolved into the silence, only the sound of the wind remained, cleansing the canyon of their presence, as if they had never been there. Montenegro's men returned in pieces, not all at once, but in scattered groups that trickled back to the ranch with the first grey light of dawn. They were dirty, scratched, some without hats, others with the empty eyes of someone who has seen a ghost. Mateo was the last to arrive, his face a mask of exhaustion and shame. Don Ricardo was waiting for him on the porch. The previous night's anger solidified into a cold, deadly fury. "Where is my horse? Where is the savage's head?" he hissed. Mateo swallowed hard, unable to meet his boss's gaze. "He disappeared, senor. The canyon, it turned against us. It wasn't a man we were hunting. It was the wind itself." The excuse sounded pathetic, but it was the only truth he had. Don Ricardo's response was a violent slap that knocked Mateo to the ground, an act of impotent frustration that did nothing to erase the image of a young Apache riding toward the horizon. While humiliation poisoned the air of the Montenegro ranch, Nahuel guided shadow out of the mouth of the canyon. The rising sun bathed the plains in gold and rose, washing away the shadows of the night. For Nahuel, the night had not been a battle, but a ritual. He had not sought to harm, only to teach. He had shown those men that their boss's barbed wire fences ended where the real land began. Beneath him, shadow moved with a new lightness, the gait of an animal that had not only been freed, but had remembered who he was. They were not fugitive and mount, but companions, two parts of a whole heading not to a hideout, but to the Redlands, the place where the legends of his people still lived in the dust and stones, waiting to be awakened. At the ranch, the morning sun brought no warmth, only a cold light that exposed the humiliation of the previous night. Don Ricardo was no longer shouting. The hot anger had cooled into a sharp ice, an obsession that poisoned his blood. He locked himself in his office, not to mourn the loss of a horse, but to plan the annihilation of a symbol. The Apache had not only stolen his property, he had stolen his aura of invincibility. Before a map spread over the mahogany table, he made his decision. If his men could not hunt a ghost, he would hire demons. The news would spread like wildfire, a reward, a fortune, in gold, for the capture of the Apache known as Ojo de Viento. It was no longer about honor. It was about erasing the stain, about ensuring that Nahuel's legend died before it even learned to walk. Far from the darkness gathering in Montenegro's heart, Nahuel and Shadow traveled under a vast, clear sky. With each passing hour, the bond between them deepened, becoming a silent communication of muscle and intention. The land changed under the horses' hooves, the sparse grass giving way to a reddish dust, and the gentle hills turning into rock formations that rose like forgotten monuments. They had reached the threshold of the Redlands, a sanctuary of rock and sky that pulsed with the memory of his people. Nahuel felt the change in the air, an ancient energy that welcomed him. He stopped on a rise, looking out at the crimson landscape that stretched to the horizon. This was not a land to be owned. It was a land to belong to. And there, in the blood of the earth, he would prepare. For the war he knew was coming. The news of the reward spread like a plague through the dusty villages and trading posts. It did not attract men of honor, but the vultures that thrived on the misery of others, bounty hunters with dead eyes, gunslingers whose names were whispered in dark cantinas, and men without country and without soul, willing to sell each other for a handful of gold coins. The story that drew them in was fantastic, distorted with each retelling. They spoke of an Apache who commanded spirits, who disappeared into solid rock, and whose horse was a reborn demon. The initial mockery gave way to a cautious greed. Montenegro's gold was real, but the ghost they had to hunt seemed woven from fear itself. In the Redlands, Nahuel did not hide. He merged with the environment. The place was not a refuge, it was a living sanctuary, and he moved through its secret arteries with an ancestral familiarity. He and Shadow spent days in silent movement, not to flee, but to remember. Nahuel rediscovered the hidden springs, the shelters under cliffs engraved with the symbols of his people, the hunting trails that were invisible to untrained eyes. He was not accumulating weapons, but knowledge. He listened to the wind to know of movement miles away, watched the flight of hawks to map the terrain, and felt the presence of his ancestors in the heat that emanated from the rocks at dusk, a silent force building in his chest. The first wave of bounty hunters that reached the Red Lands was nothing like Montenegro's cowboys. They were harder men, with the sun etched into deep wrinkles and cruelty embedded in their eyes. Led by a burly man named Silas, who wore a bear tooth around his neck, they entered the sacred territory with a noisy contempt. Ghosts and whispers of the wind, Silas scoffed to his companions, his voice raspy with whiskey. Montenegro's gold sings louder than any spirit. To them, the land was just an obstacle. They knocked over small memorial stone, piles with their horses' hooves, and shot at a vulture circling overhead, just for the fun of seeing the bird fall, the sound of the shot echoing like a blasphemy. On a ledge miles away, Nahuel did not hear the shot, but he felt it. He felt the sudden silence of the insects, the disturbance in the flight of a distant hawk, and a dissonant vibration that rose through the soles of his moccasins. Beside him, Shadow raised his head, his ears pricked forward like daggers, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Nahuel placed a hand on the horse's neck, a gesture that conveyed both calm and alert. He didn't need to see the intruders to know they had arrived. They brought with them the disease of Montenegro's world, a noisy greed that could not see that in this land silence was the most powerful weapon, and that they were already completely surrounded, not by men, but by the very land they desecrated. Silas and his men advanced under a merciless sun that turned the red rocks into incandescent anvils. The air was still and dry, and with each passing hour, the water in their canteens became hotter and more precious. Shadow's trail was a ghost, visible on a stretch of sand and then disappearing completely on slabs of stone that seemed to stretch for miles. "He has to stop for a drink," Silas growled, more to himself than to the others. But all the springs they found were dry, the mud pools cracked like broken pottery. The silence of the land was overwhelming, broken only by their own clumsy noises, and the confidence with which they had entered this place began to erode, replaced by a growing irritation and a fear that no one dared to name. From a dark crevice high on a cliff, Nahuel watched them drag themselves through the bed of a canyon that narrowed with every turn. He was in no hurry. He waited until the last man in the group passed by an unstable rock formation, a delicate balance of stones eroded by time. Then, with a calculated move, he used the tip of a long pole to push a single keystone near the top. The result was not a noise, but a deep groan from the earth itself. A rumble followed that grew into a deafening thunder as tons of rock and dust collapsed, sealing the passage through which they had entered. The sunlight was obscured by a red, suffocating cloud. When the dust settled, Silas's men found themselves trapped, facing an impassable wall behind them and an unknown path ahead, the echo of their newly sealed tomb still vibrating in the air. The panic for a moment was silent, choked by the dust that scratched their throats and burned their eyes. When the red cloud dissipated, the reality set in like a tombstone. Silas was the first to move, stumbling towards the new stone wall, beating it with his fists until they bled. "It was no accident," he bellowed at the sky, his voice hoarse with dust and dread. "He buried us alive." The bravado had crumbled, replaced by the primal fear of a caged animal. The other men looked from side to side, no longer at their leader, but at the canyon walls that now seemed to lean in on them, and at the path ahead, which no longer promised a reward, but only a narrow corridor toward the unknown. From above, Nahuel did not linger on the site of their panic. His face was a mask of granite, his eyes fixed not on the men, but on the land that had answered his call. He had not decreed a death sentence, but one of judgment. With a touch that was more thought than gesture, he turned, and Shadow moved with him, as if they were one being, disappearing back into the folds of the rock with the fluidity of a shadow. He no longer needed to watch them. He had delivered them to an older, more relentless judge. Thirst, the scorching sun, and the fear they had brought with them into that sacred land. The sepulchral silence that followed the rockslide was broken by an ugly, desperate argument. The camaraderie forged by greed disintegrated, turning into a poison of accusations and fear. "This is your fault, Silas. You led us into this demon trap," shouted one man, his face pale beneath the layer of dust. Silas, in turn, tried to reassert his leadership with a punch, but the gesture was weak, devoid of conviction. They were trapped. Water was scarce, hope even more so. Their only option was to move forward, deeper into the canyon's throat, that only allowed for swallowing, praying for an exit on the other side. But as they walked, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the unseen presence of the one who had cornered them, and every step seemed to be taken towards their own grave. Back at the ranch, the days dragged on under a white, indifferent sun. The silence that Don Ricardo hated so much had returned, heavier and more threatening than ever. No news came from the bounty hunters. Not a messenger, not a rumor, nothing. It was as if the Redlands had simply swallowed Silas and his men. Montenegro's obsession deepened, eating away at him from the inside. He spent his nights in his office staring at the map, at the red stain that represented the Apache's territory, now looking like an open wound on his empire. The lack of news was, in itself, a message. The ghost he was trying to exorcise with gold was becoming more real, more powerful, fed by the very silence of its victims. 2 days passed inside that rock labyrinth, a purgatory of thirst and scorching sun. The arguments had turned into a resigned silence, and the men, once hunters, were now just staggering survivors. On the morning of the 3rd day, as they rounded a bend, they stopped, their eyes filled with disbelief and terror. In the middle of the path, they found their canteens lined up near a crevice. They were filled with cool, clean water. Beside the water, a neat pile of their own weapons, revolvers, rifles, and knives. On top of the pile, a single eagle feather. The Apache had not killed them. He had disarmed them, humiliated them, and then dismissed them as if they were children who didn't know how to play. It was Silas who returned, but not the man who had left. He arrived on foot, dragging himself through the gates of the Montenegro ranch, the bear tooth he wore around his neck dangling on a skeletal chest. His eyes were empty, his skin burned, and his voice was a scratch of madness. Before a livid Don Ricardo, he babbled about a ghost who stole sound and moved mountains, who gave them water and took their souls. He told of the miraculous water and the vanished weapons, showing Don Ricardo the eagle feather as if it were a cursed artifact. Don Ricardo did not see a survivor. He saw the collapse of his own order. At that moment, his fury turned into a resolve as cold as steel. "Prepare my horse," he said to a cowboy, his voice low and lethal. "If demons cannot hunt this ghost, then the devil himself will." The cowboys prepared Don Ricardo's horse in a funereal silence. It was not Shadow, but a purebred Spanish stallion named Relampago and Tame, animal of impeccable lineage and controlled fury, the exact opposite of the wild spirit that had been stolen. Montenegro did not wear his rancher's clothes, but those of a hunter, dark leather, a long-range rifle slung on his saddle, his face as impassive as a stone mask. He took no men with him. The humiliation was his, and the revenge would be as well. As he rode out of the gates, alone, the afternoon sun cast his long, solitary shadow, like an accusing finger pointing directly at the heart of the Redlands, Far away, on a windswept plateau that served as a viewpoint for the ancient gods, Nahuel felt the approach before he heard or saw it. It was a dissonance in the song of the land, a cold note of metal and revenge carried on the air. Shadow felt it too, his body tensing under Nahuel, his nostrils flaring, scenting not a man, but an intention. Nahuel closed his eyes, the eagle feather he had recovered from Silas tucked in his hair. He knew the man who was coming was not seeking gold or a horse. He was coming to erase the very concept of Nahuel, to silence the land he represented. Slowly, he stood up, his eyes opening to gaze at the horizon. The final confrontation would not be a battle for a ranch, it would be a fight for the soul of that land. This fight for the soul of the land comes down to this moment. Leave your support for Nahuel in the comments and subscribe to find out who will emerge victorious in this inevitable confrontation. Thank you for following this journey with us.